For as long as I can remember, whenever people talk about being a daughter-in-law, they often picture the classic drama, the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law clashes, or the tension between sisters-in-law. But my story is different. Today, I want to share with you a true story about my life, a story that involves my father-in-law. I hope you'll read and feel the emotions I went through. My name is Emily Harper, and I'm 25 years old. I work as an office assistant, and my job is decent enough. I've been married for 5 months to my husband, Daniel Carter, who's the same age as me. He also works in an office, but at a different company. Daniel's mother passed away years ago due to illness, and his father, Robert Carter, is 55. He just retired and now spends his time at home, though he also does some part-time work at the local community council. Despite his age, Robert still looks quite handsome and fit. Daniel told me that his mom passed away over a decade ago, but Robert decided not to remarry. He focused on raising his daughter and son, making sure they were both settled. Now that his daughter is married and Daniel has a wife, Robert finally has some time for himself. He just retired, but he's already taken up that part-time role at the community council. Daniel's older sister is married and busy with her kids, so she only visits occasionally. For the first 5 months of our marriage, everything was peaceful. Robert has always been kind to us. Right after we got married, Daniel and I started living separately from him, so I didn't have to deal with the typical daughter-in-law duties. I'd just bring over some food for Robert whenever I made something special. Daniel inherited his father's good nature, and I felt so lucky to have him. My own mom once told me, marrying Daniel means you don't have to serve as a traditional daughter-in-law, so you'll have an easy life with no pressure. She was relieved for me because her own experience as a daughter-in-law was tough. My grandmother was the strictest woman in our town, and my mom struggled a lot back then. Our house is a 2-story home that Daniel built with the money he earned while working in Japan. Robert contributed some funds to help finish it, but he insisted on living in the small guest house next to our main house. It's the same place he and his late wife lived in when they first got married, and it holds a lot of memories for him. Daniel tried to convince him to move into the main house with us, saying we'd already built this big, new place and could tear down the old one, but Robert refused. "I'm used to this little house," he said. "It's where your mom and I started our life together. I can't let it go." No matter how much Daniel insisted, Robert wouldn't budge. So, he still lives in that guest house, and we share a small courtyard between our homes. Everything was calm for nearly 6 months, until one day, I ran into an old friend from high school, Sophie Miller. I was walking through the local farmer's market when I heard someone call out, "Emily, is that you?" I turned around and saw Sophie, my old classmate. She looked so different now. "Sophie, is that really you?" I asked, surprised. "It's been forever." "Yeah, it's me," she said, smiling. "I just got back yesterday afternoon." "So, what are you up to these days, Emily?" "I work in an office," I replied. "What about you? How was Japan? Did you do well over there?" "It was okay," she said. "It's been 5 years, hasn't it? You look even younger now, Emily." I laughed. "No way, I can't compare to you. You've changed so much since you went to Japan, I almost didn't recognize you." Sophie smiled, but then her expression shifted. "So, Emily, are you married yet?" "Yeah, I got married," I said proudly. "I married Daniel, you know, our class president from high school. We've been married for almost 6 months now." Sophie's face darkened. 6 months? How long did you two date before that?" "We dated for about 2 months before we got married," I explained. Daniel was working in Japan, and when he came back, we ran into each other, started talking again, and things just happened fast. We already knew each other from school, so it didn't feel rushed. Sophie looked stunned. "That's quick." And Daniel never mentioned anything to me about it. "We worked together in Japan, you know." I was surprised. "You worked with Daniel in Japan?" "He never told me that." "Yeah," she said. "We were at the same company, even lived in the same apartment complex. He finished his contract 8 months before I did and came back to the States. I stayed longer, and when I got back, I heard he'd gotten married. I had no idea." I was thrilled to reconnect with an old friend who also knew my husband, so I invited her over. You should come to our place sometime when you're free, Sophie. She nodded, but her expression wasn't exactly happy. That evening, I excitedly told Daniel about running into Sophie, but he seemed distant, just nodding and mumbling in response. I noticed his lack of enthusiasm and asked, "Didn't you work with Sophie in Japan?" She said you two were at the same company. Daniel looked at me with a nervous expression, his voice hesitant. She told you that? Yeah, I said. She mentioned you left Japan 8 months before her. Did she say anything else? No, that's all, I replied. He sighed, looking relieved. Let's not talk about that. It's late. Let's go to bed. I mentioned Sophie might come over to hang out sometime. Daniel frowned. Come over? Why would she do that? What's wrong with that? I asked. She's our old classmate. It'd be nice to catch up. His face hardened. I don't like that idea, Emily. Sophie isn't a good person. She's calculating and materialistic. You shouldn't get too close to her. I was confused. Why would you say that? You worked with her in Japan. You'd know her better than I do. Exactly, he said. I worked with her, so I know what she's like. Just trust me on this. I'm only looking out for you. Don't be friends with her, okay? I didn't fully understand, but since Daniel insisted, I decided to trust him. Okay, I'll keep my distance. I'll just be polite, nothing more. Good, he said. It's better that way. People like her will only bring trouble. The next day, Sophie texted me, inviting me to grab coffee, but I remembered Daniel's warning and politely declined. The day after that, she texted again, asking if I'd eaten and trying to chat, even offering to treat me to dinner sometime. I ignored her messages, but she kept texting, acting like we were close friends. It felt strange, but I brushed it off, thinking she was just being friendly since we were old classmates who'd reconnected. Then, one day, I picked up Daniel's phone and noticed a missed call from Sophie's number. He had blocked her, which meant she couldn't reach him anymore. That made me wonder, if they were so close in Japan that they'd saved each other's numbers, why did he block her? Could there have been something between them back then? I was curious to know the truth, but every time I tried to bring it up, Daniel brushed me off, so I let it go. A week later, Sophie showed up at our house. Daniel wasn't home. It was just me and Robert. She brought a big basket of fruit as a gift. Emily, is Daniel here? She asked. He's at work, I said. Come in, sit down. She glanced outside and noticed Robert working in the yard. Is that your father-in-law out there? He looks so young and fit for his age. I smiled. Yeah, that's him. Everyone's been trying to set him up with someone, but he's not interested. He says he's too old to remarry. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. He looks so youthful, though. He should find someone to take care of him in his later years, don't you think? We've all tried to convince him, I said, but he won't budge. Sophie stayed for lunch that day. I went to the market to buy ingredients, cooked a meal, and invited Robert to join us. During lunch, I noticed Sophie kept glancing at Robert, her eyes flirty and suggestive. Robert, being a serious man in his 50s, seemed uncomfortable with her attention. He finished eating quickly and excused himself to go back to the guest house. After lunch, I washed the dishes while Sophie peeled some apples and grapefruit. Where did your father-in-law go, Emily? She asked. He went back to the guest house, I said. I'll bring some fruit down for him later. Sophie stood up. Why don't I take it down for him? You finished the dishes. I nodded. Sure, thanks, Sophie. She smiled and headed down with the fruit. I thought Sophie was just being friendly and outgoing. How could Daniel say she wasn't a good person? She seemed so warm and helpful. Down in the guest house, Robert was sitting at his desk, going through some paperwork. Sophie walked in, standing close to him as she set the fruit on the table, deliberately brushing her hand against his. Here's some grapefruit for you, sir, she said sweetly. Robert smiled awkwardly. Thank you, dear. No problem, she replied, lingering. She looked around the small, simple house, noticing how neat and clean everything was. Your place is so tidy, sir. It's impressive. Robert chuckled. I have a lot of free time, so I keep it clean. Sophie sat down next to him. You've been living alone for so long, don't you ever think about finding someone new? No, he said. I'm used to being on my own. She tilted her head, her tone soft. I hope this isn't too personal, but don't you ever feel lonely? Robert paused, thinking for a moment. Sometimes, I suppose. Sophie nodded. I understand. I feel the same way. I've been alone for a long time too. Robert looked surprised. You? How so? I've been an orphan since I was a kid, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. My grandparents are gone now, so it's just me. I feel so lonely sometimes. I spent years working abroad in Japan, and now that I'm back, it's still the same. Those lonely days just keep coming. Robert felt a pang of sympathy for her. You should find someone to marry, he suggested. Then you won't feel so lonely. Sophie sighed. I used to think that too, but I was wrong. I've dated younger guys, and they always leave me for someone else. I don't trust them anymore. Honestly, I've been thinking about dating someone older, someone mature, someone who won't abandon me. Don't you think that makes sense? Robert smiled gently. That might not be the best idea. Older people think differently from the younger generation. But older men are more stable, more committed, right? She pressed. They're not as impulsive as younger guys. I want something long-term. Robert nodded. That's true, but it's up to you. Maybe you should try dating someone older and see how it goes. Sophie looked at him with a sly smile. What if I wanted to date someone like you, sir? Would that be okay? Robert was taken aback, scratching his head nervously. I'm too old for you, dear. I'm 55, and you're so young, only 25. How could that work? Why not? She said, leaning closer. I like you. I really do. But you don't even know me that well, he protested. I do, she insisted. I was classmates with Daniel and Emily. I know all about you. Robert shook his head. I'm sorry, dear. I'm used to being alone. You should find someone else. Sophie pouted, placing her hand on his chest. Why don't you give me a chance? We might be a good match. Robert was overwhelmed by her boldness. He turned away, but she grabbed his hand, placing it on her chest. Please, just try, she whispered, her hand sliding down to his thigh. Robert quickly pushed her hand away, his face turning red. I really like you, she said, her voice sultry. He was flustered. Never in his 55 years had he felt so embarrassed. Before he could respond, Sophie wrapped her arms around him, sitting on his lap, pressing herself against him in a way that stirred feelings he hadn't felt in years. For over a decade, he hadn't been with a woman, and now his body was reacting despite his better judgment. Upstairs, I was eating some grapefruit, wondering why Sophie hadn't come back yet. Is she planning to stay down there forever? I muttered to myself. I decided to go check on her. As I approached the guest house, I noticed the door was open. I called out, Dad, Sophie, are you there? But what I saw next made my heart stop. Sophie was on top of Robert, both of them completely undressed, locked in an intimate embrace on the chair. I quickly turned away, my voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I saw the door open. Sophie didn't even flinch. It's fine, Emily. Go back upstairs. Robert and I aren't done yet. I stammered, oh okay, and ran out, my mind reeling. I overheard Robert panicking inside. Oh no, Emily saw us. What do we do now? Sophie replied calmly, don't worry, darling. We're in love. They'd find out sooner or later. There's nothing to be ashamed of. I stood outside, my hands shaking, unable to process what I'd just witnessed. My father-in-law and Sophie in love? Since when? And they were together like that? I couldn't believe my eyes. About an hour later, Sophie came back upstairs, sitting down to drink some water as if nothing had happened. She looked at me and asked, you must be pretty shocked, huh? I nodded, still in disbelief. Yeah, I'm surprised. I never thought you and my father-in-law would. Well, now you know, she said with a smile. What do you think? I hesitated. I mean, as long as you two truly love each other, I support it. I don't have any objections. Her face lit up. That's great to hear. I really like Robert, Emily. I want to take care of him. As long as you and your family support us, I'd love to marry him. Can you put in a good word for me? Sure, I said. I'll support you. Thanks, she replied. I'll head out now, but I'll be back tomorrow. Okay, see you, Sophie, I said. Before leaving, she went back to the guest house to say goodbye to Robert. Darling, I'm heading out, she called. Robert nodded. See you, dear. She gave him a quick kiss. I'll come visit tomorrow. Make sure you're ready for me, okay? I love you. Robert, who had been lonely for so long, felt a spark of youth with this young, vibrant woman. He seemed happier than ever, humming a tune as he went about his day. Seeing my father-in-law so joyful made me happy too. I'd always felt bad seeing him alone in that guest house, so knowing he'd found love warmed my heart. But then a thought crossed my mind. Why would someone as young as Sophie, who's never been married, fall for an older man like my father-in-law? In this world, I guess anything can happen. That night, I told Daniel about what I'd seen. Honey, you won't believe this, I said. It's about Sophie and your dad. Daniel frowned. My dad and Sophie? What about them? They're in love, I said. I saw them together in the guest house. They were intimate. Daniel looked stunned. What? That's ridiculous. My dad and Sophie? No way. I'm serious, I insisted. I saw it with my own eyes. They were, together. Daniel's face turned red with anger. Sophie came here? And she did that with my dad. Yes, I said. I know it's shocking, but they seem to really care for each other. Older men with younger women. It happens, right? Daniel clenched his jaw. No, I won't allow it. My dad can be with anyone, but not her. You don't understand, Emily. What don't I understand? I asked. Why are you so upset? He didn't answer, his silence making me uneasy. I tried to press him, but he closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, so I dropped it. From that moment, things started to spiral out of control. Daniel went down to the guest house and confronted Robert, saying he wouldn't allow him to be with Sophie. When Robert asked why, Daniel called her a horrible person who wasn't good enough for his father. But the truth was far more complicated and much worse than what he said. Despite Daniel's objections, Robert had already fallen for Sophie, and she wasn't letting go. When Daniel banned her from coming to the house, Robert started sneaking out to meet her. No matter how much Daniel protested, their relationship continued in secret. Robert told Daniel her past is her past. I only care about who she is now. The tension between father and son grew, and they argued constantly for a week. Daniel stopped speaking to Robert altogether. Then, Sophie moved into the guest house with Robert. That evening, when Daniel came home from work and saw her standing in the courtyard with Robert, he exploded. Why are you still here? He shouted. I told you I don't approve. Sophie hid behind Robert, who glared at his son. You disrespectful brat. Sophie is living with me in the guest house. It doesn't affect your life. Why are you trying to stop me? I was cooking dinner when I heard the shouting. I ran out to pull Daniel inside, while Sophie dragged Robert back to the guest house. The argument ended, but the atmosphere in our home became unbearably tense. No one spoke to each other, and when I tried to ask Daniel what was going on, he snapped at me, so I stopped asking. But I knew there was more to the story. Sophie's past couldn't be the only reason for Daniel's anger. Sophie and Robert seemed happy living together in the guest house, but Daniel was furious. One day, he came home early from work, looking exhausted. He saw Sophie hanging laundry in the courtyard and tried to hold back his anger. No one else was home. Sophie turned to him with a smirk. Hey, love, long time no see. How's your life going? Daniel clenched his fists. Why did you come back here? What's your goal? Simple, she said. I came back to be your stepmother. Daniel gritted his teeth. You're the most shameless person I've ever met. Sophie laughed. Funny, because back in Japan, you didn't mind being with someone like me. I came back because I don't want to let you go, Daniel. We live in the same house now, doesn't that make things fun? Daniel shook his head. You're delusional. Do you even realize why I left you? Let me remind you. 2 years ago, I met you in Japan. You were working as a prostitute. I convinced you to quit that life, got you a job at my company, and we started dating. I loved you. I worked hard to support us. But you couldn't change. You went back to selling yourself, right in the company bathroom, charging $500 a session. I'll never forget the video my friend sent me, men lining up outside the bathroom, waiting their turn with you. It was disgusting. Sophie shrugged. But I gave you the money I made. I just wanted to make your life easier. I didn't need your money. Daniel shouted. You did something so vile, how could I forgive you? You think you're some high-class escort? You were cheap, Sophie. I told you to stay away from my dad, don't ruin his life too. Robert came home just then and saw Daniel yelling at Sophie, who was now acting weak and pitiful. Robert glared at his son. What are you doing to her, you jerk? Daniel ran his hands through his hair in frustration. Dad, you have to choose, me or her. Pick one. Robert was furious. Why are you so against her? Her past is done. Let it go. Why are you so selfish, always digging up people's history? I'm not being selfish, Daniel said. Just choose, me or her. Robert grabbed Sophie's hand and pulled her inside, his actions speaking louder than words. Daniel's eyes burned with anger. From that day on, father and son stopped speaking entirely, each living their own lives, refusing to even look at each other. Sophie was thrilled to see the rift between Robert and Daniel. She spent her days doing nothing but hanging around Robert, cooking for him, and staying by his side. Whenever Daniel was home, she'd find ways to provoke him, stirring up arguments between him and his father. Her goal in coming back was clear. She wanted to get back at Daniel for leaving her, and she planned to make his life miserable forever. Since Sophie moved in with my father-in-law, Daniel and Robert became estranged, constantly fighting because of her. I started to suspect there was more to her intentions. One day, I overheard a conversation between Sophie and Daniel in the guest house. It was brief, but it was enough to confirm my fears. Back in Japan, Daniel and Sophie had been in a relationship. I was shocked. To me, this was a horrifying revelation, father and son in love with the same woman, living under the same roof, seeing each other every day. Sophie must have hated Daniel so much to come here and do this. After a few days of silence, I couldn't hold back anymore. I came home from work and saw Sophie casually opening the fridge in our main house. That fridge belonged to me and Daniel. Robert had his own in the guest house. What are you looking for, Sophie? I asked. She turned around, unfazed. Just seeing if there's anything to eat. There's nothing in the fridge downstairs. You shouldn't use other people's things without asking, I said. That's not okay. She frowned. We're all one family here, Emily. Why are you being so stingy? We're not one family, I replied. And even if you and Robert get married, you'd be my stepmother-in-law, not my family in that sense. Sophie smirked. Oh, I'll be your stepmother-in-law soon enough. Don't worry. That day won't come, I said firmly. You only came here to get revenge on Daniel. Don't think you can fool everyone. What if Robert finds out the truth? He'll kick you out. Sophie laughed. What do you know, Emily? You don't know anything. I know more than you think, I said. I'm warning you. Leave on your own before things go too far. If you don't, you'll be the one who gets hurt. She scoffed, mocking me. Oh, you're so righteous, Emily. How does it feel knowing I'm Daniel's ex, and now I'm living in the same house as you, about to become your stepmother-in-law? I think you're the one lowering yourself, I said. As for your past with Daniel, that's history. We live in the present, not the past. So stop trying to dig up old stories, it's pointless. Sophie sneered. They say old flames never truly die, Emily. Aren't you afraid Daniel and I might rekindle things, living so close like this? I clenched my fists, my anger boiling over. Daniel was right about you. You're cheap, Sophie. You'll throw yourself at anyone. You're like expired food, useless and thrown away. Sophie was furious, unable to respond. She stormed down to the guest house, and I tried to calm myself down, refusing to let her get to me. From that day on, I couldn't sleep. The truth about Sophie kept me up at night, tossing and turning. Daniel seemed to sense my unease, and he finally opened up. Emily, I need to tell you something, he said. Do you know why I'm so against my dad being with Sophie? It's not just because of her past, it's because she and I used to be together. I nodded. I already know. Why didn't you tell me sooner? We're husband and wife. Don't you trust me? It's not that, he said. I was afraid you'd misunderstand me, so I kept it from you. But you know everything now, don't you? Even why Sophie came back, she's here to get revenge on me. He went on to explain why he'd broken up with her. Hearing the full story left me even more shocked. Sophie had lived a reckless life, sleeping around without shame. It was unacceptable. Daniel sighed. She's so immature, trying to ruin my life. Who knew my past mistake would come back to haunt me like this? You deserve it for dating someone like her in the first place, I said, half joking. But how could I stay with her after what she did? He replied. She said she was helping me by earning money that way. Can you believe it? It's disgusting. And now she's set on marrying my dad to get back at me. What do I do, Emily? I don't know, I said. At this point, stopping them might be impossible. Maybe you should start calling her mom soon. Daniel groaned. This is such a mess. I'm so sorry for putting you in this situation. It's okay, I reassured him. As long as you don't make the same mistake again, I'll be fine. I won't, he promised. I swear, I'll never fall for her tricks again. She was the biggest mistake of my life. Even as Daniel and I quietly declared war on Sophie, Robert was still smitten with her. He even planned to marry her by the end of the year. His retirement pension and part-time income weren't enough to keep up with Sophie's spending, so he started dipping into his savings to buy her things. Love, whether for the young or old, can make people blind, can't it? Although they weren't officially married yet, Sophie started acting like she owned our house. She'd come into our main house, use our things, and walk around in revealing clothes. One morning, Daniel got up early to exercise, and Sophie followed suit, wearing a thin pink nightgown with nothing underneath. She flaunted herself in front of him, saying, "You're up early, Daniel. Still as handsome as ever, huh?" Daniel ignored her, but she kept pushing. Remember how happy we were back in Japan? We were so in love. Daniel snapped. Shut up, Sophie. She smirked. Why so angry? We had some wild nights together, didn't we? Daniel raised his hand to slap her, but Robert came out just in time, yelling, "Daniel, stop it." Daniel lowered his hand, glaring at Sophie with disgust before walking away. Sophie clung to Robert, playing the victim. He almost hit me, Robert. He doesn't approve of us. Robert was furious, believing Daniel was being selfish and unreasonable. Sophie kept stirring the pot, making the rift between father and son grow even deeper. The next day, Robert called a family meeting with his siblings to announce his upcoming wedding to Sophie. Everyone was shocked, especially when they saw how young and beautiful she was, 30 years younger than Robert. Daniel refused to attend, staying in our room, so I sat through the meeting alone. Robert wanted to have the wedding next month, despite everyone saying it was too rushed. He asked his siblings to help pick a good date and prepare for the engagement ceremony. I didn't say anything, I was just the daughter-in-law, and I had no say in the matter. I knew Sophie wasn't a good person, but I didn't know how to convince Robert otherwise, and I doubted anyone would believe me if I spoke up. That Sunday, I was off work and cleaning the house. Sophie sat on the couch, watching me mop the floor. "This house is shared property, right?" she asked casually. I turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" "I heard it's a shared house," she said. "Not really," I replied. Daniel built this house with the money he earned in Japan. He borrowed some from Robert to finish it, but Robert always said he wanted Daniel to have it as his own. That's why Robert lives in the guest house. Sophie smirked. But Robert contributed money, so it's shared, isn't it? Daniel borrowed $250,000, and the house cost $1.2 million to build. Back then, Robert planned to live alone in the guest house forever. But now that he's getting married, things should change. You should clean out a room, Emily. Robert and I will move up here. I'm not staying in that old guest house. That's for Daniel to decide, I said. I can't make that call. Daniel can't do anything about it, she replied. If parents don't live with their son, who else would they live with? I'm about to become your stepmother-in-law, Emily. Don't be disrespectful. I couldn't hold back anymore. You're young, Sophie. Why don't you start over instead of holding on to grudges and making more mistakes? Do you really think you can ruin Daniel's life forever by doing this? You'll never be able to let go of your hatred. You don't need to worry about that, she said coldly. Just focus on yourself, Emily. I'm worried for you, I said. Your conscience must be eating at you. Who tries to get revenge on an ex by marrying their father? You're doing this to hurt Daniel, but you'll never be able to move on from the past either. Why don't you let it go instead of clinging to it? Sophie's voice turned icy. Because I want Daniel to remember me for the rest of his life. I want him to see me every day, to call his ex Mom. That's what makes it fun, Emily. I was furious. How could someone be so cruel and selfish? I couldn't control myself anymore. I lunged at her, grabbing her hair and slapping her face. You disgusting, shameless woman. I shouted, hitting her again. Sophie ran out to the courtyard, and I grabbed a broom, chasing after her. I hit her with the broom, and she fell to the ground. She got up and ran toward the gate, screaming as I chased her down the street, hitting her with the broom. Neighbors rushed out to stop me, and Sophie finally escaped. From that day on, Daniel and I became the talk of the town. People labeled us as selfish, saying we wouldn't let Robert remarry, even though his wife had been gone for over a decade. They pitted Sophie, believing we were the bad guys. Daniel had already cut ties with his father, and now I was the daughter-in-law who'd attacked her father-in-law's girlfriend. We were infamous in the area. At the market, the butcher even said to me, Emily, just let your father-in-law marry her. His wife's been gone for years, and he's old now. Having someone to take care of him should make your life easier. I hesitated. It's complicated. Outsiders wouldn't understand. What's complicated? She asked. They love each other. If she didn't care about him, she wouldn't have moved in with him. I sighed. I can't explain it, but Daniel and I are just trying to protect Robert. I didn't say more, revealing the truth would only make things messier. I decided to fight Sophie to the end. When I got home, I saw Sophie cleaning out a room on the first floor. What are you doing? I asked. I'm getting the room ready, she said. Robert and I will move up here this afternoon. What about the guest house? I asked. We'll sell it, she replied. No one's going to live there, it'd be a waste to keep it. I couldn't believe it. Robert had always cherished that guest house, saying it held all his memories with Daniel's mother. He'd sworn never to sell it. But now, with Sophie in his life, he'd changed completely, willing to sell it just to please her. That evening, Daniel came home and saw Robert and Sophie watching TV in our living room. He was surprised. Robert had always watched TV in the guest house and never came up to the main house. Sophie smiled at him. You're back from work, Daniel. Daniel ignored her and headed upstairs, but Robert slammed his hand on the table. What's with that attitude? Why didn't you answer, Sophie? Are you deliberately disrespecting us? Daniel smirked. Sophie is my mom? I only have one mother, and her name was Grace. She's gone. I don't know any mom, Sophie. Robert was livid. You ungrateful child. I raised you, and this is how you treat me. Sophie tried to calm him down. It's okay, Robert. We're not married yet. Let's not rush the titles. But Robert was still angry. This brat doesn't know how to respect his elders. Daniel shot back. I don't need her to defend me. Just wait. Dad, you'll regret marrying her. You'll see. I heard the shouting from upstairs and rushed down to pull Daniel away. Honey, let's go upstairs. It's late. Let the neighbors sleep. Sophie and Robert went to their room, but Daniel turned back to ask, You're staying up here now? What about the guest house? Sophie smiled sweetly. We're moving up here, Daniel. The guest house isn't needed anymore. We'll sell it. Daniel glared at her. You used to refuse to sell it, Dad. You wanted to keep it for the memories. Did she talk you into this? Your pension can't keep up with her spending, so you're selling the house to fund her lifestyle. Once the money's gone, she'll leave you. Sophie started to cry, playing the victim. Why are you so harsh, Daniel? What did I do wrong? Daniel scoffed. You're worse than I can even describe, Sophie. I dragged Daniel upstairs before the argument could escalate further. In our room, he was still fuming, punching the wall so hard his hand bled. When he finally calmed down, I said, "Your dad's changed so much, Daniel." I barely recognize him. "It's all because of her," he said. "She's manipulating him." "What if we just let them get married?" I suggested. "She'll reveal her true intentions eventually." "You mean we should agree to the marriage?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I don't believe someone as manipulative as Sophie will actually marry him. She's just pretending. I think she's planning to scam your dad for money, drive a wedge between you two, and then leave." "Are you sure it's just a plan?" he asked. "I'm not completely sure," I admitted. "But let's keep quiet for now and stop fighting with your dad. We'll watch and see what she does." "What about the house he wants to sell?" Daniel asked. "We'll tell him to sell it after the wedding," I said. "If she's not serious about marrying him, she won't get any money." Daniel nodded. "Let's see if she dares to go through with it." From then on, Daniel and I started acting friendly toward Robert and Sophie. I'd cook meals, clean the house, and treat them kindly, even though Sophie never helped. Daniel stopped being harsh. He'd greet his dad before and after work. Robert was surprised by the change in Daniel's attitude. At dinner one night, I cheerfully asked, "Dad, have you picked a good date for the wedding?" "I asked some relatives to check," he said. "They said the 18th of next month is a good day." "Great," I said. "Let me know what you need to buy for the ceremony. I'll get it ahead of time so we don't forget anything." Robert glanced at Daniel to see if he'd object, but Daniel sighed and said, "It's your decision, Dad. I've thought it over, and I'll support you. As long as you're happy, that's what matters." Robert was stunned by his son's words. He smiled warmly. "Thank you, son. I'm sorry if I've been harsh lately. Forgive me." "I'm sorry too, Dad," Daniel said. "I was too hard on you. Don't be mad at me." Seeing father and son reconcile, Sophie's face darkened. She started to feel uneasy. Daniel and I had decided to go along with the marriage to see how far Sophie would take her act. I didn't believe someone as scheming as her would actually marry Robert. Daniel suggested that Robert visit Sophie's family to discuss the wedding formally, but Sophie made excuses, saying everyone was busy and they should delay it a few days. At the family meeting, she sat quietly, barely saying a word. Later, at a coffee shop near our house, Sophie met with her friend Lydia. Lydia noticed Sophie looked distracted. "What's wrong, Sophie?" she asked. "I heard you're getting married?" Sophie sighed. "No way I'd marry that old man." "Then why are you doing this?" Lydia asked. "It's a plan," Sophie said. "A revenge plan. I'm going to take his money and leave right before the wedding." Lydia laughed. "That's the Sophie I know. But you're bold, living with him so openly." "What does Daniel say?" "He's tried to kick me out plenty of times," Sophie said. "He and his dad fought constantly, they even stopped speaking. But now, out of nowhere, Daniel agreed to the marriage." "I don't get it." "He probably gave up fighting," Lydia said. "You should wrap this up soon." "Has the old man sold the house yet?" "That's where the money is." "I've been pushing him to sell," Sophie said. "But he's waiting for a better offer." Robert had been trying to sell the guest house because Sophie kept pressuring him to get money for their wedding preparations. A few people came to look at it, but the highest offer was only $1 million, and Robert was hesitant. Sophie kept urging him, saying, "Sell it, darling. We need the money for our honeymoon." Robert wanted to wait for a better deal. "I'd sell for $1.5 million, he told her. $1 million is too low. Just wait a bit. We'll have enough for a nice honeymoon in Japan." Sophie pouted. "I don't want to wait. I want to go to Japan. There's nothing fun in the States." Daniel and I came up with a plan to keep the house. Daniel asked a friend from abroad to pretend to be a buyer, offering $2 million. Robert and Sophie were thrilled and agreed to sell, but the friend said he couldn't finalize the deal for another month due to work. Sophie was frustrated. Waiting a month would ruin her plan to take the money and run before the wedding. She tried to convince Robert to sell for $1 million instead, saying, "I need the money now for wedding stuff." But Robert, with Daniel's support, refused. $2 million is a fair price, Daniel said. $1 million is too low. Just wait a month, Dad." Sophie was furious. She told Robert she was going to her place for a couple of days, but when he didn't come to pick her up, she came back on her own, her face sour. While Sophie was gone, Daniel and I installed a hidden camera in our bedroom to catch her true intentions on tape. For the next few days, she seemed quieter, as if she was planning something. Daniel took some time off work to stay home and keep an eye on her. Robert was at the community council most of the day, coming home for lunch. Sophie, still bitter about Daniel leaving her in Japan, started provoking him again. One morning, she saw Daniel shirtless, washing the courtyard with a hose. She walked over, her eyes lingering on him. "You're still as attractive as you were back then," she said, licking her lips. "I can't help but think about Robert. He's 55, but he's so weak. It's boring." Daniel ignored her, but she kept going, trying to flirt with him while he worked. Later, while Daniel was napping in our room, Sophie snuck in. She ran her hands over his back, kissing him, her eyes filled with desire. Daniel woke up and pushed her away. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "I miss you so much, Daniel," she said, trying to pull him closer. He shoved her off, and she fell to the floor, yelling, "You idiot. I'm throwing myself at you, and you won't even take it." Unbeknownst to her, the camera had recorded everything. The next day, Daniel stayed home again, cleaning the house shirtless to bait her. Sophie came back from breakfast and saw him. "You're so hardworking, Daniel," she said, her tone flirty. "I didn't know you were so good at chores." "I can do a lot of things," he replied. "I even fix stuff around the house." She smirked, pressing herself closer. "I'm feeling a bit broken myself. Can you fix me?" Daniel pushed her hand away. "Enough, Sophie. Behave yourself with my dad. He's too old to keep up with you. Go find someone younger." She batted her eyes. "I don't need to. I have you here, Daniel." He stepped back. "Leave me alone, Sophie." She followed him to our room, trying to seduce him again. As she leaned in to kiss him, Daniel kicked her away, and she fell, crying out, "You're so cruel, Daniel. I'm genuine with you, and you treat me like this?" In her frustration, she blurted out the truth. "You think I'd actually marry Robert? He's older than my own dad. I'd never marry that old man. I'm only here for the money. Once I get it, I'm gone. I'm not crazy enough to marry him." Daniel smirked. "You're the crazy one, Sophie. Turn around." She spun around and froze. Robert and I were standing there, having heard everything. She stammered, "When did you two get back?" Robert sighed. "We just got here, Sophie. Do you have anything else to say?" She ran to him, grabbing his hand. "Robert, Daniel and I were just joking. It's not what you think." "Enough," Robert said. "I saw the footage from the camera a few days ago, but I couldn't believe it until I saw this with my own eyes. You're so young, yet you live so selfishly. Please, believe me," she begged. "Daniel and I were just messing around." I stepped forward, pushing her hand away. "That's enough, Sophie. I've tried to stay calm for the sake of our old friendship, but you'll never change. Your greed is in your blood. I'm telling you now, leave and live a better life." Sophie pleaded with us, but when she realized it was hopeless, she packed her things, muttering, "My plan's ruined." I didn't even get the money, back to square one. She drank a glass of water, then left without another word. After Sophie was gone, Robert sat down, lost in thought. Daniel and I comforted him. "I'm so sorry, kids," Robert said. "I was fooled by her. I've caused you so much trouble." Daniel smiled. "It's okay, Dad. It's over now. Don't dwell on it." "Thank you both," Robert said. "What about the house?" "We already made a deal with that buyer, Kwang." "Do you really want to keep it, Dad?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Robert said. "Then it's simple," Daniel replied. "I'll call Kwang and cancel the deal." "Can you really do that?" Robert asked. "Of course," Daniel said. "Kwang is my friend." The whole sale was part of our plan to expose Sophie. Robert finally understood everything, his eyes welling up with tears. He felt ashamed for being deceived by someone so young. He vowed never to let it happen again, taking it as a hard-earned lesson. A year later, Robert found a new wife, a kind, hardworking woman named Margaret, who's nearly 50 and never married. They were introduced by my uncle, and they get along wonderfully. They now live together peacefully, taking care of each other and helping us by watching our newborn while Daniel and I are at work. As for Sophie, I ran into her friend Lydia recently. She told me Sophie went back to Japan and returned to her old life as a prostitute. Sophie said she couldn't make it in the States, and with her lazy, reckless nature, that lifestyle suited her best. It's a sad, fleeting life, and no one knows where it'll lead her. But for us, life has settled into a peaceful rhythm, and we've moved forward, leaving the drama behind.